is Stephen Lamonde, an adjunct instructor at Antioch, and he is going to tell us all kinds of fascinating things about golden-winged and blue-winged warblers.
Great. Thank you, Corey. Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to talk with all of you tonight about golden wing and blue wing warblers. I don't know why, but I personally like to say golden wing warblers first. Perhaps that's how I learned it from Mark Labar, one of my mentors at Audubon, Vermont. But yeah, I'm not sure why that is. So before we get started, I'd just like to see a quick show of hands, and you can easily raise a digital hand via Zoom or a hand up on your screen. How many of you have seen a golden-winged warbler?
I have, yeah.
A couple people. All right, no worries. They are quite rare. And how many of you have seen a blue-winged warbler? A slightly more common species depending on where you're from. Good. Alrighty. So if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat box. I'll try to monitor that throughout the evening, or feel free to unmute yourself if you like. I do have dedicated time for questions at the end, but if anything's confusing or if you'd like me to repeat something, feel free to jump right in with your question at that moment. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, is everybody able to see my title slide? Wonderful. So just another quick reminder, please keep yourself on mute unless you're unmuting to ask a question. That way we won't get any feedback. And if the bandwidth does slow down on your end, or if I start to break up, please let me know. And sometimes turning off your video can help get a smoother presentation. So a little bit about me before I start talking about these wonderful birds. My name is Stephen Lamonde. I do teach at Antioch University, New England, where I teach graduate courses in GIS, or Geographic Information Systems. It's like a Swiss Army knife for mapping. So we do lots of sort of analytical techniques on a computer. And I love to apply these analytical techniques to some of my favorite birds, the vermivora warblers. So I'll be showing you some maps throughout the evening and describing the analytical process that I've used most recently to you tonight. I've also started teaching for the Harris Center for Conservation Education based in Hancock, New Hampshire, where I currently live. I also teach for Keene State College's continuing education program, and I've recently been hired as an ecologist with Moosewood Ecological, a regional ecological consulting company. And we offer guided bird walks as well as naturalist walks through that. So if you have any questions, or if you want to gift someone a guided walk for a birthday or upcoming event, send me an email and I'd be happy to talk with you about that. So some of you might already have question marks about my interesting title, Baking a Habitat Cake. Well, tonight we're going to talk about what is a habitat cake and how do we make one, and how does it apply to Vermont's vermivora warblers. So before I dive into the nitty-gritty of my presentation, I just want to acknowledge all of the people and organizations who have helped support and fund our research efforts in Vermont over the past 5 or 6 years. Number of faculty and staff at Antioch University, Mark and Margaret at Audubon, Vermont, a number of field techs, a lot of undergraduate students from UVM, and then funding from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Vermont Fish and Game, Natural Resource Conservation Service, Vermont Land Trust, and of course, the many, many towns, conservation commissions, local land trusts, and private landowners throughout the Champlain Valley of Vermont. We've had the wonderful pleasure of working with so many individuals on this project, and looking forward to working with new people as this project continues into the future. So a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'll give a brief introduction to the vermivora warblers, talk about the birds in that genus and their ecology and population trends, dive into the GIS modeling side of baking a habitat cake, talk about future research and ways people can get involved through eBird. We'll have dedicated time for questions, but again, feel free if you have a burning question to ask it right then and there. And then this might come a little after 8 p.m., so if people need to go, that's fine. But I did make a selection of photos taken from our field research over the past 5 years, so you can stick around to look at some of our work. So to begin, the genus Vermivora, which means worm eating, currently contains 3 species. First, the blue-winged warbler, which is often abbreviated to BWWA. So you'll see this abbreviation throughout the presentation, and that refers to a blue-winged warbler. The golden-winged warbler, GWWA, very strikingly contrasting bird to the blue-winged warbler, and the Bachman's warbler, which is believed to be extinct. And I don't think many people are searching for it nowadays, but it was last seen in 1988. It's usually found, when it was found in the southeast of the United States. So currently, we're at these 3 species. However, back in the 1870s, there were believed to be 5 species in this genus. The blue-winged warbler and the golden-winged warbler, of course, but also the Brewster's warbler, the Lawrence's warbler, and then the Bachman's warbler. However, between the late 1870s and 1881, 1904, around the transition of the century, the ornithologist Brewster started to believe that the Brewster's warbler and Lawrence's warbler are actually hybrids of a blue-winged warbler and golden-winged warbler. And this is what we know today. However, back in the 1870s, these birds looked so different that it wasn't possible for them to be in the same species. But we developed this idea of hybridization, and so we're in the early 1900s, we recognized just those 3 species, Bachman's, blue-winged warbler, and golden-winged warbler. So for these birds, it was thought that they had a typical Mendelian trait for the blackness of their throat. If you had a recessive gene, you would get that black throat. However, the more dominant gene was a non-black throat. So in the blue-winged warbler, we see this bright yellow throat, and in the Brewster's warbler's hybrid, we have a white throat. So again, dominant genes, you get a non-black throat for blue-winged warblers and Brewsters, and it's rarer to have that black throat. It's a recessive gene. So this is how it's notated in genetic terminology: capital letters for dominant genes, lowercase letters for recessive genes. And when you have the case of a capital T or a dominant gene paired with a recessive gene, the dominant gene it takes effect. And so even if a recessive gene is present in the bird, but also a dominant gene is present, the dominant is what takes the form on the bird. And then again, 1988, we say goodbye to the Bachman's warbler. Until it's rediscovered, we can always hope. And now we're just left with blue-winged warblers and golden-winged warblers. So where does that leave us? Well, a recent study analyzed the complete genomes of golden-winged warblers and blue-winged warblers. And this is thanks to technological advancements. Prior to this, we had to just look at certain sections of a genome and analyze for differences. So golden wings and blue wings are they have about 20,000 genomic regions, yet only 6 of those regions, 0.03% of the entire genome, was different. So this is what it looks in a pie chart. Golden wings and blue-winged warblers and their hybrids share 99.97% of their DNA. And they're only different by 0.03%. Well, that's not very much. So let's take a closer look at that small sliver and see what's there. So despite looking so different, they're incredibly similar. From this 0.03% genetic difference comes a huge diversity of our winged warblers. So that's the blue-winged warbler, golden-winged warbler, Brewster's warbler, Lawrence's warbler, and all the other hybrids and their combinations. So we get this incredible diversity in their plumages, and that's only from 0.03% of their DNA. So are they one species or are there 2 species? I am not going to attempt to answer that question tonight. Arguments can be made for why they should be the same species or why they shouldn't be. From my standpoint and from the standpoint of Audubon, Vermont, we are working to conserve the Vermivora complex. And so that's both species combined. In Vermont, they prefer the same habitat, young forest adjacent to mature deciduous forest. And that's our goal, is to create more of this habitat and maintain existing habitat so that both species, even if it's one species, can continue to evolve and do what they do best. Well, that's a fun food for thought conversation to have when you're out birding or meeting with others. Ask them, should golden wing warblers and blue wing warblers be considered the same species? So here are some arguments for why they should. That small difference between golden wing warblers and blue wing warblers is about the same as humans with and without freckles. It's also comparable to two different subspecies of Swainson's thrush. So these are subspecies, yet they're still considered Swainson's thrush. However, golden wings and blue wings are less genetically different than those two subspecies. So strong arguments for why they should be the same species, even though they look incredibly different. Moving on. So what this genetic study that David Teves did in 2016, they captured a bunch of golden wing warblers, blue wing warblers, and their hybrids, and they created a plumage score to give these birds, and then they also did a genetic analysis. And with this, because these birds look so different and their genetics are so similar, we can use how a bird looks to identify how genetically pure it is or how much of a hybrid the bird is. However, there are a couple limitations which I will point out in a second. So if we move over to the graph on the right, you'll notice that the plumage score on the x-axis or the bottom axis goes from 0 to 38. The closer to 0 a bird scores, the more it looks like a golden wing warbler. The closer to 38 a bird scores, the more it looks like a blue-winged warbler. And then moving to the y-axis or the vertical axis, we have a genetic score. So looking at the actual DNA of each bird and scoring it. 0 would be it has 0 alleles of the blue-winged warbler, therefore it's a pure golden wing warbler. And 12 means it has all 12 genetic differences of a blue-winged warbler, making it a pure blue-winged warbler. So when we look at a spread of the data, it's not a straight line, but we do see a trend. So pure golden wing warblers tend to look like pure golden wing warblers. At the same time, pure blue wing warblers tend to look like pure blue wing warblers. And that's where we get these boxes here that I've outlined. So these birds in the bottom left, these are genetically pure golden wing warblers. They're going to look like a golden wing warbler. And then the top right-hand corner, these birds are pure blue-wing warblers. They're going to look like a blue-wing warblers. But it gets a little tricky when we look at these birds here. And we call these birds cryptic hybrids. So because they're on top of this yellow box here, they're getting a low plumage score. These birds look like pure golden wing warblers, but we see that they have between 1 and 5 DNA markers of a blue-winged warbler. Same here in the top right-hand corner of this purple box. These birds look like pure blue-winged warblers, but genetically, they have 2 to 4 DNA markers of a golden-winged warbler. So it's impossible to know 100% looking at a winged warbler whether or not it's genetically pure. The only way to know 100% is to get a genetic analysis done of that bird, which is expensive and not available to the everyday birder or bird watcher. And so what we do is we can generalize the birds that we're looking at, score them with this technique, and either mark it as a pure bird, a hybrid, or something in between. And so a lot of the birds we encounter, especially in Vermont, are what we call intragressed hybrids, aka just a hybrid. And so these birds have traits of both a golden wing warbler and a blue wing warbler. So we get things like the Brewster's warbler, we get things like the Lawrence's warbler, and then all sorts of mixes and matches of yellows and grays and whites all over the body. So these are sort of the 3 different groups that we can fit birds into. So what are the characteristics of a pure golden wing warbler versus a pure blue wing warbler? So I'd like to just take a minute and poll the audience here. When you're looking at a winged warbler, what do you look for? What defines a golden wing warbler versus a blue wing warbler? And for those of you who are not very familiar with these birds, I've created some pictures for you here. So in your own words, if 1 or 2 people would like to unmute, feel free to describe these birds and what characteristics you see.
I'll go.
Sure, go ahead.
Blue-winged have white wing bars and golden-winged do not.
Sure, excellent point. So it's all in the name. The golden wing warblers have that golden patch on the wing, whereas blue wing warblers have a bluish gray wing, especially towards the primaries, and 2 white wing bars. Would anybody else like to share some characteristics that stand out to them?
The blue wing warbler has an all yellow head where the yellow wing has the black throat and the stripe going through the eye.
Absolutely. So in the blue wing warblers, we see mostly yellow head. In females, one of the ways you can tell them apart from males is the extent of the olive green on the back of the head comes more onto the crown of the head in females, whereas in male blue wing warblers, we see yellow towards the rear of the head. Then they have a thin black eye line, and that's about it for colors. But then we go ahead to over to the golden wing warbler on the left. We see this dark, contrasting black throat, a black mask or auricular patch, a white supercilium or eye line, a white mustache, and a golden crown. So lots of contrasting colors all in the head right there for the golden wing warbler. So I've created a list here of all of the characteristics that define a pure golden wing warbler versus a pure blue wing warbler. And there's a lot of different parts of a bird that you can look at to gauge if it's genetically pure or if it's a genetic hybrid. So for golden wings, a black throat, that wing bar that's gold is broad and confluent. It's a single patch of yellow color on the wing. The nape or the back of the neck is gray or white. Mustache and eyeline are white. Compared to the blue wing warbler, we see no black on the throat whatsoever. We see 2 well-defined wing bars. They're narrow. They're also entirely white. So things to note, and if people want copies of these slides or online resources after the presentation, please reach out and I'm happy to send those along. So this is what we look for when we're trying to identify a pure golden winged or blue winged in the field, because we can't do a genetic analysis for every bird we come across. So these are the characteristics we look for when identifying these birds. So a little bit about golden wing warblers. They've declined quite precipitously since 1966. Why 1966? That's when the Breeding Bird Survey was started and people started doing standardized bird surveys throughout the United States and southern Canada. And so everywhere in this map that is red, the golden wing warbler population is declining at a relatively rapid rate. Anything that's in yellow, the population is fairly stable. And anything that's in blue, especially dark blue, the population is actually increasing. And so throughout most of their range, golden wing warblers are rapidly declining. Since 1966, their population in the Appalachian Mountain region has declined about 98%. And population-wide, they're declining about 67%. So more than most North American songbirds. Why is this? Well, for a long time, people thought this was due to genetic swamping. So when blue wing warblers come into contact with golden wing warbler populations, there tends to be an exchange of DNA. Blue wing warblers will mate with golden wing warblers and vice versa, and they'll create these hybrids. And so this map here on the right identifies what we think is the current hybrid zone between blue wing warblers and golden wing warblers. And so for a long time, this genetic swamping, where blue wing warblers, they have more dominant genes, they're slowly taking over the gene pool of golden wing warblers. And maybe that's why we're seeing golden wing warblers decline. For thousands of years before colonists got to North America, it was thought that these birds were living in geographically separated areas. And there was a small and thin hybrid zone where they would sometimes come into contact with one another. But then Europeans came over and started deforesting much of the North American landscape, and this brought blue wing warblers and golden wing warblers into close contact with one another, allowing for more interbreeding, more hybridization, and more genetic swamping. And now blue wing warblers are running rampant and overwhelming the golden wing warblers. Well, it turns out that that might not be the case. So one of the things that's been noted by a number of researchers is that when blue-winged warblers were arriving, golden-winged warblers would disappear within 50 years. So that was a key factor in why people thought this. However, we now know, thanks to recent research from 2019, that this isn't the case. What's actually happening, the strongest predictor of golden-winged warbler decline actually takes place on the wintering grounds. And so when it comes to golden-winged warbler conservation, this species is typically broken up into two populations, one around the Great Lakes that stretches from Ontario and Minnesota east to Vermont and southern Quebec, and then the Appalachian region, which is in the Appalachian Mountains from Tennessee all the way up to southern New York in some places. And we see that there's quite a strong difference in how the population is changing over time. The Great Lakes population is declining a little bit, but it's relatively stable compared to the Appalachian Mountain population, which has declined by about 98% in the past 50 years. And so why is this? Why are they different? Let's take a look at this figure, and this shows where the birds are migrating. All of the golden-winged warblers from the Appalachian population are migrating into Colombia and Venezuela, whereas all blue-winged warblers, for the most part, and all golden-winged warblers from the Great Lakes are migrating to Central America, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. So what's happening there on the wintering grounds? Well, deforestation is a major issue in South America, but less of an issue in Central America. And so we see that the devastation of their wintering grounds in South America is really literally killing the golden-winged warblers that are migrating there from the Appalachians. Whereas the birds, pretty much the entire blue-winged warbler population and the Great Lakes section of the golden-winged warbler population, they're migrating to Central America where there's less deforestation. Costa Rica has a very strong ecotourism industry, where forests are being protected, and therefore these birds are protected for that half of the year when they're down in Central America. And that's a big explainer why we see there's a more stable population of golden-winged warblers in the Great Lakes region. And it also explains why blue-winged warblers are not declining nearly as rapidly as golden-winged warblers. That's because very, very few blue-winged warblers are migrating to South America for the winter. So this, we think now, is the strongest indicator for population decline. So what can be done on the breeding grounds? It costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of organization to work with people at an international scale to save a particular bird species, and National Audubon Society is doing a great job with that. But for Audubon Vermont and local land trusts, what can we do to help golden-winged warblers on our breeding grounds here in Vermont? And I say here in Vermont, even though I live in New Hampshire, because I've been studying golden-winged warblers in Vermont for the past 5 or 6 years. This past year was very sad. I wasn't able to get over to Vermont at all during the breeding season because of the pandemic. But hopefully, if vaccines roll out soon, I'll be able to get back up there to help out with the next study next summer. So Vermont, lucky duck of a state, you have the last population of golden-winged warblers in New England. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was thought that golden-winged warblers were extirpated from the region. They could no longer be found in New England. However, some early surveys in the late 2000s, early 2010s, they found a couple breeding pairs of golden-winged warblers in the Champlain Valley. More surveys in 2014 yielded about 70 breeding pairs of golden-winged and blue-winged warblers. And since then, we've detected larger numbers than we thought previously existed, which is very encouraging. And so this map here, the pink outlines the Appalachian Conservation Region, that section of the population. The purple is for the Great Lakes Conservation Region. And each of these yellow blocks are different golden-winged warbler focal areas. And so here in Vermont, I believe this section of the Champlain Valley is focal area number 16. And we're pushing to get this one in southern Quebec extended down into the northern end of the Champlain Valley, where we have found golden-winged warblers. So when it comes to birds and really all things wildlife, it's better to think about their habitat and where they live in terms of ecoregions. So these are sections of the landscape that have similar forest or land cover characteristics, and that could be due to bedrock or climate, things of that nature. And so when I mentioned the Champlain Valley, it's not a political boundary that I'm referring to, although I could say Franklin County, Chittenden County, Addison County. But really, it's the Champlain Valley ecoregion. So it extends from West Haven, Helen G. Buckner Memorial Preserve, all the way up to the Canadian border and the northeastern part of Lake Champlain. And it's bordered on the west by Lake Champlain and bordered on the east by the spine of the Green Mountains. Or really the foothills of the Green Mountains is that border on the east. And so this is where we're doing our primary research on golden-winged warblers, because this is where most of them are found. However, there are a couple exceptions I'd like to note. One is the Rutland area, specifically in large power line right-of-ways. We have found golden-winged and blue-winged warblers there. And then I believe a couple summers ago, there was, oops, sorry about that. There's a breeding either blue-winged warbler or hybrid somewhere in Windsor County. In the Connecticut River Valley. And so these birds have turned up periodically during the breeding season in the Connecticut River Valley. But aside from there, the Champlain Valley and the Vermont Valley near Rutland, that's about it in the state where golden-winged and blue-winged warblers can be found. Thanks, Kevin. Windsor Grasslands had at least one male last year. That's great, blue-winged warbler. So it'd be great to monitor that location to see if that bird or other birds keep coming back. So recently at Audubon, Vermont, one of our goals has been how do we conserve this vermivora complex? And we like to use the golden-winged warbler as a flagship species that gets people excited about conserving young forest habitat. But we've recently broadened that to include blue-winged warblers, since in Vermont they're selected for the same habitat. So our first goal is to figure out where these birds are and then do some targeted, standardized surveys so we can get a better population estimate of how many golden wings and blue wings and hybrids are here in Vermont. And goal number 2 is to then work with foresters and landowners and other organizations to either maintain or create golden-winged warbler habitat. And so here I show a brontosaurus machine chopping down some trees to allow for new growth to come up that'll support young forest and the animals and insects and plants that love that. So when it comes to Vermont, how do we access land? Well, 82% of Vermont's land is privately owned, which makes access difficult, to say the least. Within the Champlain Valley, it's a lot closer to 90 or 95% that's privately owned. So there's very few public places where one can find golden-winged warblers. Corey and I were talking a little bit earlier before most people joined. A lot of people head up to Hinesburg, Vermont at a place called Japregs Community Park, and that's might be where they see their lifer golden-winged warbler. I think about 20% of all golden-winged warblers are reported from that community park, just because it's one of the few public places that have golden-winged warblers in the Champlain Valley. But there's a number of others. So in 2019, we surveyed fairly intensively the northern Champlain Valley and found places in St. Albans, in Georgia, and Highgate that have golden-winged and blue-winged warblers that people can go and see. Further to the south, the Charlotte Park and Wildlife Refuge is another wonderful place to see golden-winged and blue-winged warblers. And then the Helen G. Buckner Memorial Preserve down in West Haven. Excellent habitat there. We're working with the Nature Conservancy to create 80 acres of pure golden-winged, blue-winged warbler habitat over the next couple of years. So that's a very exciting project. So I'm going to take a deep dive now into how are we identifying where golden-winged warblers are, because it's very tricky to get out on private land, and it can take a lot of time, a lot of effort. If there's sort of unguided surveys. We're driving out in a car and doing roadside surveys as best as possible, but wouldn't it be great if we could train a computer to do that work for us and help us predict where we're more likely to find winged warblers so we can save time and money and resources and have a greater chance of finding these birds when we do go out. So that's what I'm going to talk about mostly tonight. So the first step is to talk with local experts. Where do they know these birds to breed? And can they identify these locations on a map for us to use? Once we know where these birds are breeding, step 2 is to work with a software that I'm familiar with called ArcGIS, and I'm going to create spatial and statistical models to predict where we can find these birds based on where we know they already exist. So we look at those known breeding sites, and we also come up with a couple potential breeding sites to support that modeling process. And then, of course, no computer model is great without going out to validate it in the field and see, did it actually work? So that's step 3, is doing some field surveys to figure out how well does this computer prediction work, and how can we improve it for future use. And through this, we get our recipe for golden wing warbler habitat. So speaking of recipes, I'd like to sort of outline what golden wing warblers are selecting for when they come to Vermont. So their breeding habitat can be described as vertically patchy. We see lots of herbaceous forb cover on the ground, but also patches of shrubs and scrubby trees, things that don't really grow too high, maybe a little over head height. But then there's these lone trees, or patches of 2 or 3 trees here and there throughout the landscape. So we see this vertical diversity in vegetation structure. From a horizontal standpoint, so taking a bird's eye view and looking straight down, we see that it's horizontally patchy as well. So this is an aerial photo taken from somewhere in the Champlain Valley. We see a neighborhood, small neighborhood with some mature forest here on the left. And then we go into our habitat. Thank you, Jordan, for your comment. This is the ideal habitat for golden wings and blue wings, really patchy. We see a couple standing trees here and there, some grassland cover mixed in with some bushes, but no one dominant land cover type. And then further to the east, or the right in this image, we have some sort of agricultural field, a different agricultural field to the south, and yet a third type of agricultural field in the bottom southwest corner. So let's all dive back to our childhoods and think about our favorite cake recipe. Perhaps mom made it, or dad. And here's what it contained. There were several cups of flour, even more sugar. Something's not sounding right here. Some vanilla or none. Okay, that sounds pretty flexible. I don't remember mom being that flexible with us. Lots of butter and not too many eggs. If I were going to try to bake this cake based on those instructions, I wouldn't have exact amounts, and I certainly would not end up with a good tasting cake. And so this is where we've been at with describing golden wing warbler habitat. We need a couple acres of mature forest, more young forest, however, some wetland or none, we're not really sure, lots of herbaceous plants, but not too much water. If you gave these instructions to a forester, they'd be awfully confused. We don't know what to do with this. We're going to make a disaster of the landscape. We're not going to create the winged warbler habitat you want us to, because your instructions are not specific enough. So our goal is to add numbers to these amounts to help landowners and foresters create the habitat that will support golden wing and blue wing warblers. So what we do is we do something called an image classification. It's a sort of soft version of AI, so using computer intelligence. And what it does is it translates an aerial image on the left into different classes on the right. And so you can see some differences between the two. I'd like to walk through a couple as an example. Notice the road and the houses, they stick out with this bright white color. And the computer is all sorting those into one class, probably paved or impervious, and it shows up as a dark blue color over here on the right. We see that the mature forest surrounding the houses is a mix of reds and yellows. And we see that in the trees themselves, there's lots of green, of course, in the canopy, but also shadows and other colors. And so each color gets sorted into a separate class on the right-hand image. Now the computer's a little smarter because it can see things like wetness in the image on the left that our human eye can't really pick out. We might be able to pick out the pond here, sort of in the center right, and it does show up here on the right-hand image as purple. However, in these agricultural fields down here, especially this one, it looks very solid light green, yet the computer is able to pick out wetness to the soil and other characteristics that our human eyes are incapable of picking out. And so it's broken this field into multiple different classes, different land cover types. And so with this sort of extra vision that the computer lends us, we can then lean on some extra analytical methods to quantify these different classes and come up with a recipe for golden wing warbler habitat. So I'm going to go through a couple graphs and you can test this out. So for class 1, that light purple, none of it is in the golden wing warbler habitat. Yet for class 9, that brownish color, we see that it's modestly contributing to golden wing warbler habitat. And so we come up with a Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold. We want to identify just the right amount of each land cover type that's contributing to golden wing warbler habitat. And once we do this, we get a fingerprint for golden wing warbler habitat. We can come up with percentages and say golden wing warblers need between 15% and 35% deciduous forest, very little coniferous forest, between 0 and 6%, quite a bit of scrub shrubs, so that young early successional forest, 35 to 70% give or take, and lots of grassland, but not too much. They need that bottom layer of forbs, that good nesting material that they use, but again, lots of shrubs. That's the main component. So we're using a computer and training it to come up with this fingerprint that can help us identify golden wing warbler habitat. Once we do that, we go through a couple steps. We do a statistical analysis and transform this onto what we call a suitability scale. Green is good, red is bad. That's all you need to know for the next couple images. And we do this for each class. We combine all the classes back together until we get a sandwich with just one layer. Green is good, red is bad. We see that our training polygon there is showing up with lots of green, so it's working. Lots of good habitat in that region. And then once we do this, we take just the highest amount, or the darkest greens, and we export that and say that is our golden wing warbler habitat. So once again, we see this purple here is showing up. That's good, not through our entire training polygon, but a fair amount. And we're also identifying nearby areas of good golden wing warbler habitat. There's a couple small patches in the middle of the woods or at the edge of a field. Those are probably model errors, but that's okay. So in this next step, I'll show you why that's all right. So for each parcel, every single parcel in the Champlain Valley, we quantified the total area and the density of potential habitat to help us narrow down how many parcels we needed to visit to do these surveys. So we found a little under 9,000 parcels with potential golden wing warbler habitat. That's pretty good. That's a lot of landowners that can get excited about these special birds on their land. However, we had 3 people to do surveys this one summer, and there was no way we were going to get to that many parcels. So we had to narrow it down somehow. Our first criteria was to look at parcels that were at least 9 acres. So if we're going to go there, there has to be a fairly large amount of land, enough for us to validate surveying that property. They also had to have at least 5 acres of potential habitat. So that's enough room for 1, maybe 2 breeding pairs of golden wings or blue wing warblers if they existed. And then we had a scoring index, and they had to score at least a 70 out of 100. If a property had at least these 3 criteria, and 216 of them did, so that's narrowed it down quite a bit, we mailed out letters to all these landowners. We were able to reach out to 183 different people, and we heard back from 50, and 47 of them gave us permission to go out and check out their properties. It was really great. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to get to everybody's property, but we did the best that we could. So just a quick summary: we take an image that's been taken from an airplane, we convert it into computer language, we run it through a statistical analysis to come up with a suitability score for golden wing warbler habitat. We combine all of those scores into one final pancake or recipe, and then we export just the tip top, the cream of the crop, best locations, and say that's what we're going to go with. And then we prioritize our parcels from there. So if you want to ask me any questions about the GIS analysis, if you're really interested about that, feel free to ask at the end of the presentation or send me an email afterwards. So how did it turn out? How did the computer do? Well, we went to 28 of the highest priority properties. I think we went to 42 properties in total. Just some of them were opportunistically given. We were given permission to survey. But 28 of those highest priority parcels that we found using the computer model, 85% of them had golden wing warblers, which is really encouraging. In total, about 1.25% of the Champlain Valley has potential golden wing warbler habitat, so that's a little under 10,000 acres. And so based on those numbers, we did a rough back of the napkin calculation, said there could be about 600 breeding pairs of winged warblers in the Champlain Valley. That's a rough guess, but we've validated that with some other analyses. But that's the number you can tell your friends if they ever ask you how the population's doing, which is a lot better than when we originally found 70 in 2014. Also, not only was the model pretty good for finding golden wing warblers and blue wing warblers, we also found lots of eastern towhee, prairie warbler, field sparrow, and brown thrasher, which are all species of greatest conservation need in the state of Vermont. What do these birds have in common? Young forest, that early successional forest growing on old agricultural fields that have been released, and it's before they've developed into mature forests. That in-between stage is where we find these birds and winged warblers. And so our computer model was able to do a pretty good job of figuring out where those patches of young forest are in the Champlain Valley. Young forest is also great for a number of other species, not just golden winged and blue winged warblers, but also ruffed grouse, American woodcock, bobcat, rat snakes, box turtles, white-tailed deer, and a whole lot more. So what Audubon Vermont is doing is we're gathering lots of people behind the golden winged and blue winged warblers, getting them excited about these species to create and protect young forest, knowing full well that by protecting golden winged warblers, we're also protecting these species as well. So where do we go from here? Well, there's a new technology out nowadays called LiDAR, and it creates a three-dimensional image of the landscape. So all of this computer modeling that we've done before was based in 2 dimensions from an aerial image. What LiDAR does, well, for those of you unfamiliar with this technology, it stands for light detection and ranging. Typically an airplane is flying over the land and it's sending out a laser pulse on different wavelengths, and it's calculating the elevational distance from the airplane to whatever the light is bouncing off of. And so what this does is it not only captures what's there on the ground, but also the density of what's on the ground. So as the laser, and this is harmless to wildlife and people, so you don't have to worry about any health effects, but as the light beam heads towards the ground, it's reflecting off of each large branch in a tree, and then it gets to the ground and it can't penetrate any deeper than the leaf litter. But it's returning multiple points of data, and what we get is a really detailed and beautiful image of the landscape. Can anybody guess what's pictured here?
A pond surrounded by trees.
Great guess. So we do see blue at the bottom. This is just saying it's the lowest elevation. So it's not actually a pond, it's the ground. But yes, it is. It's a section of forest, and we can see the detail of trees collected from LiDAR data, which is fascinating. I've been working with GIS and spatial data for almost 9 years now, and never before we've been able to get detail to data sets quite like this. So how do we apply it to birds? Of course, that's exactly where my mind goes. And well, before I dive into that, I want to show you a couple more images of what LiDAR can do. So a top view, we see a river or a wetland here cutting through the middle of this section, and then forest going up to the edges. So the more red the color, the higher the elevation, and the more blue, the lower the elevation. So here's a top view on the left and a cross section on the right. We can filter this for bare earth. So this has helped me find things like lost forest roads from the 1800s, cellar holes from the 1700s, and things that are now covered by trees and you would never be able to find from an aerial image. But with LiDAR, it's almost like we're power washing the vegetation away and we can see what's underneath and get a fine, detailed look at the landscape. And then we can also calculate things like height above ground. So if you think back to golden wing warbler habitat, they need that diversity of vegetational structure, low grass, medium height scrub shrub, and tall mature trees. Well, with LiDAR, we can now quantify exactly how much of each of those vertical components they need for their habitat. So combining this three-dimensional approach with our two-dimensional data model, we get a more detailed fingerprint of what golden wing warbler habitat looks like. And this gives us a more complete recipe to give to foresters and private landowners who want to manage their land for golden wing warbler habitat. So this is from Charlotte Park and Wildlife Refuge over in Charlotte, Vermont, a little bit south of Burlington. Here's a picture on the right to let you know what this looks like if you were there on the ground. So we see really low vegetation is shaded as gray, and then the darker green, the higher the elevation. So this patch here is mature deciduous forest, tall trees. The yellow is that young forest habitat that we know golden wing warblers and blue wing warblers like. So in 2019, we did a radio telemetry study. We stuck little nano tags on the backs of birds, and they would fly around and we'd go out and track them over the course of a day and see where they went. So this one bird, we call him Dr. White because he's now been involved in 3 golden wing warbler studies. And so because of his academic prowess, we've given him the title Doctor. And he's called Dr. White because if you see him at Charlotte Park and Wildlife Refuge, he has a white color band on his leg. And so we tracked him over the course of a summer, and these are a subset of the points that we found. We know he's using the young forest, which wing warblers typically do, but he was also traveling into the mature forest a little bit more than we expected. And so one of the things we can do is draw what's called a minimum convex polygon around these points. And this is one of the ways researchers use to define a bird's territory. So this might be something they're defending from other birds, especially other male birds, throughout the breeding season. And from here, once we've delineated the territory, we can calculate percentages for different vegetation types or land cover types and come up with that quantified recipe for landowners and foresters. One of the other things we're working on is coming up with something we've always hypothesized about, where golden wing warblers have this chain of habitat throughout the Champlain Valley. And we're just now starting to visualize that on maps instead of just thinking about it in our heads. So over here on the left part of this image is just that golden chain of golden wing warbler habitat. This image in the middle, the green is forest cover, so that's mature forest. And then over here on the right, that's a satellite image taken of the Champlain Valley. So I'll draw your attention back to the middle image here. And these birds are selecting for, once again, that Goldilocks zone of how much deciduous forest cover is on the landscape. Too far west into the Champlain Valley, it's dominated by agriculture. There's not enough mature forest to support golden wing warblers. Yet once you get into the Green Mountains, there's too much deciduous forest, and the golden wing warblers and blue wing warblers won't like it. So it's this area colored in yellow. That's that happy medium, the perfect amount of mature deciduous forest available on the landscape. I don't think I covered it yet, but why is mature forest important when we know they like young forest? After the breeding season, the adult golden wing warblers will do what's called a brood split. The adult male will take half the young into the forest and find food there, whereas the female will take half the young and stay in the young forest and teach them how to feed themselves there. And so they need to be adjacent to this mature forest, typically for the post-fledging season of the breeding season. And so that's one of the reasons why it's important. We know that golden wing warblers are found here outside of the yellow chain. We are lacking the amount of standardized surveys in this part of the state in order to expand this yellow so that the statistical model can pick it up. But with your help and through eBird, documenting all of the winged warblers you're finding will really help us improve these models and make more detailed maps. And what does all of this mean? Well, it lends us, gives us stronger habitat models, then we can give more detailed recipes for landowners and foresters who are doing the work themselves. And it's a great way to interact with the public about these really special species. They're uncommon and potentially hard to find, but they're really beautiful. And landowners love it when they know that one's been found on their property and they can go out to see it. So getting back to how you can help, one of the best ways to help is through eBird, submitting everything that you find. Well, we know these birds are confusing to look at, so how do we know when we're looking at a pure bird versus a hybrid? So I've put together a helpful flow chart for you. When we're out birding, between 75 and 90% of the birds we detect are herd only, which is a large amount. And so if that's the case, we hear a typical bee, buzz, buzz, buzz of a golden winged warbler. Well, did you know that blue winged warblers also sing the song of a golden winged warbler? So in Vermont, if we hear a bird only, we don't know which one it is or if it's a hybrid. So if that's the case, submit it to eBird as a blue winged or golden winged warbler. So this everything in blue is available for what you can submit things as. If a bird is partially seen, these are warblers, they're moving around a lot, often in dense vegetation. It's hard to get a good look at these birds. If you partially see a bird, we recommend submitting it also as a blue-winged / golden-winged warbler. You can't quite tell, but you know it's in that genus. When you do get a chance to view a bird well, make careful note about its characteristics. Using the chart and the index, give it a quick plumage score and say, how many blue-winged warbler traits is it displaying? How many golden-winged warbler traits is it displaying? If it displays some of both, you can enter it into eBird as a blue-winged by golden-winged warbler hybrid. And a lot of my eBird records and data notes are, maybe 50% of them are one of these two categories, because a lot of the birds we're finding in Vermont are some sort of hybrid, or we couldn't get a good enough look at them, which is common. However, if you're able to get a very good look at a bird and the bird is displaying that signature plumage, it has all the markers of a golden-winged warbler or a blue-winged warbler, you can submit it as one of these 4 categories. So Brewsters and Lawrences are also included as hybrids, and they have their own signature plumage, which you can look up, and it's also in Sibley's Field Guide and possibly others. So with that, I'd love to open up the floor for questions, take some time for questions, and if anybody needs to head out, feel free. And if anybody wants to stick around, I have maybe another 10 slides or so just to show you some photos of these birds in the field, their nests, their young, feeding young, hybrids, and all sorts of that stuff. So any questions, comments?
I have a quick question, actually.
Sure.
So, eBird is such a powerful tool. And I know through my grassland birding that a lot of the working lands, and as you mentioned, a lot of the lands in Vermont are private. So that usually tends to overrepresent known hot spots for a lot of birds, especially for at G-Prags Park, where you can go and easily pick up both winged warblers, maybe a hooded warbler. That's a huge bias in data collection. So do you have an idea of how many of the sites where you found the winged warblers, how many of them have eBird records or are publicly accessible? Because I know that's a huge issue for birding, just getting permission to be on land. Great
question. So yeah, the majority, and I don't have a number in my head, it's probably between 60 and 70% of all winged warbler records are from public land. So there is certainly a bias there. The remaining are from private lands that people have gotten access to be there, or it's from their own yard or noted from a roadside survey or something like that. A quick side note about the hooded warbler. Mark Labar and I banded that bird in 2019. So if it shows up and it has a band, we'll now know, we'll have some age data on that bird for how long it returns. And it came into a golden wing warbler song that we were playing to attract these birds, which was really interesting. I've never had hooded warblers come into golden wing warbler playback before, but this bird did. So that's something interesting, might be worth exploring if anybody's really interested in audio and ornithology. So again, getting back to that bias, one of the things that we filter out when we do our statistical models are things like, is it public or private land? Because these birds, they don't care if it's public or private. If it has the right habitat, they'll nest there. So by focusing on the habitat characteristics, we can interpolate out from what we know about the public lands that are heavily surveyed by birders, and we can find similar areas in the Champlain Valley with the same vegetational land cover characteristics. And what's really great about people going to Japrags all the time, or Charlotte Park and Wildlife Refuge, is we start to get a better picture of spring arrival dates and fall departure dates for when these birds are leaving. We're also deploying MODIS towers throughout the Champlain Valley so that any of our birds that have nano tags on them, they ping this radio tower and they store the signal. And when the birds leave, that ping is no longer collected by the radio tower. So we can get specific departure times, potentially down to the minute, depending on the frequency we set the nano tags. So Kevin, great question. I'd love to go into more detail with it if you want to send me an email. Yeah, it'd be fun to talk about. Any other questions?
I'll go again. Nope, I don't want to.
Oh, I have a question. Do people ever see them? I live in Windham County, and I'm just wondering if we're too far south, or is it possible that we have a couple of patch cuts on our property that like 10 years old. And I was just, wondering if maybe it's possible that we would find them.
Sure, great question. So anything is possible. So you can always hope. However, that being said, I think it would be very unlikely that you could expect golden wings or blue wing warblers to be breeding in those areas.
Okay.
And there's two reasons for that. One is that we see golden wing and blue wing warbler populations, and of course the hybrids are included when I say those two species. They tend to be somewhat colonial breeders, not in the same way that swallows or swifts are, where they have one big nesting site, but the populations tend to be centered around one another. And so if you're creating new golden wing warbler habitat, it should be within 5 or 10 miles of existing golden wing warbler habitat. And that's because when the young are fledging, they're exploring new territory, trying to figure out where they might want to breed the following season. They can only explore so far before they have to migrate south. And that range where we typically see young appear the following year is 5 to 10 miles away, give or take. And so if there isn't a strong golden wing warbler population in Windham County already, I wouldn't expect them to start there out of the blue. But it's not impossible. So again, at the Windsor Grasslands, there was a bird there last year. Maybe a female will show up this year and they'll start breeding. It's possible. And then the other reason is the amount of deciduous forest on the landscape. Windham County is very forested compared to the Champlain Valley, and we think that it's a little too forested. It's not in that Goldilocks zone at the landscape scale for golden wing warblers. But if more early successional forest is created in the Connecticut River Valley, who knows? It's possible.
If I can comment, I live in Windham County, and I used to live on the power line in West Brattleboro. And we had, this is probably 25 years ago, if not a little more, but we had probably 4 or 5 years of having blue-winged warblers in the power cut. And we would get them every spring. So
fantastic.
Yeah,
some people are reporting that blue-winged warblers are a little less picky about their habitat needs. We haven't really fine-tuned that for Vermont yet. And there is a stronger blue-winged warbler population in southeastern New Hampshire and Massachusetts, Connecticut. It's just the golden-winged warblers that we see more limited to the Champlain Valley. So a blue-winged warbler would be more likely in Windham County, but any winged warbler should definitely be noted, contact me, Audubon Vermont, put in eBird. We want to know, because that's a really great sighting. Kevin, did you have a second question?
Yeah. So you mentioned Modus Towers, and I love Modus Towers, and I know that there has been some funding released to increase the number in the Northeast. I'm just kind of thinking, like, in the upper valley of Vermont and New Hampshire, there aren't, no, I can't exactly call your maps, but there aren't a whole ton of breeding populations directly north of us. So would you be kind of looking at the migration timing up the Champlain corridor primarily, or like what? Like, I'm just curious, how would that data be used? Like for your, because that's a lot of migration stuff. So like, I love the land management aspect, but like, how would that kind of factor in, I guess?
Yeah, great question. So for the Modus Towers going up towards the Champlain Valley, that's probably where our tagged golden-winged and blue-winged warblers will ping off the towers. If there's a golden-winged warbler in Quebec that decides to migrate down the Connecticut River Valley and it has a nano tag on it, it'll ping the towers. But for the towers going up in central Vermont, eastern Vermont, New Hampshire, those are going to pick up birds that have been tagged by researchers farther north. So there's a lot of shorebird studies going on in Hudson Bay in Canada. Last year at one of our Antioch University Modus sites, we picked up a red knot flying over western New Hampshire, which, they never land, but it was cool to say that they're flying over this time of year. And so in the Connecticut River Valley, central Vermont, where the Modus Towers are going up, they might be picking up things like rusty blackbirds that are being studied in northern New Hampshire, upland sandpiper, sandhill crane. Thanks, Kevin, for putting a link to that. And so, yeah, the Northeast Modus Collaborative, it's a group of organizations from Pennsylvania to New York and all of New England. They just got a huge grant to put up, I think, 50 new towers in 2 or 3 fence lines of sorts going across New England. And so any bird that's been tagged that's headed south will have to fly over the fence line, and it'll ping Modus Towers, and we'll get a more complete picture of how birds are flying south from their northern breeding site. So it's a really fascinating project, a lot of cutting edge data. I encourage everybody to go over to the modus.org website and check it out. I see a, oh, yeah. Go ahead, Kevin.
Answer the question in the chat. Don't worry about me.
Sure. Question from Bob. Are blue-winged warblers found at the edge environment created by ski slope cuts? This is the case of Blue Hills, the Boston area. Great question. I grew up in Hingham, which is just east of the Blue Hills, yet I wasn't a birder until I moved away. So I personally don't know. If I had to guess, winged warblers, so blue-winged warblers, especially in Massachusetts, they like what's called feathered edges. So instead of you going from mature deciduous forest and you take 2 steps and you're in a ski slope that's cut down to the grass level, there's no edge. There's no gradual edge to the forest where there's younger trees, shrub, and that's what these birds are selecting for. They need 35 to 75% of that young forest component. Ski slopes, to make more money, they're cutting straight through the trees. They're not allowing for these pretty young forests, pretty from a birder's standpoint, to be on the edges of the ski slope so they can maximize the number of ski trails on that mountain. So my guess is no. But I'd be curious to see if you pick up any there during migration. Forest edges is a great place to look for birds for any sort of warbler during migration. But I'd be curious to see if you find any blue-winged warblers in that area. Great. Well, thank you all for the questions. What I'm going to do now is share my screen again. I'll just share a couple pictures with you. It'll be informal, so if you have a question, feel free to post it in the chat or just ask it. And I don't think this will take longer than 10 or 15 minutes. But again, if you need to head out, that's fine too. All right, a couple photos. So this is Mark Labar, Audubon, Vermont. We're setting up what's called a mist net. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the art and the science of catching birds, we hang up a net. And if viewed from the flat side, the mesh on the net is very thin. and it's very hard for birds and humans to see. So we put this in a gap between two shrubs, and then we have a golden-winged warbler wooden model that was carved by Gary Starr, a Vermont resident. We stick it on a dowel and put it in the ground, and if a territorial male sees it, he'll come in and try to chase that wooden bird off of its property. We also use a method called playback, where we play a golden-winged warbler song to attract a male bird in and try to catch it in the net. And you do need a permit for this type of study. So we have those through the Fish and Wildlife Service. So here's Mark extracting a bird that we've caught from the net. I believe this picture was taken in Heinsberg on private property. Once we get a bird, we need to take all sorts of measurements, figure out the age of the bird, the weight of the bird. Here we see a very nice male blue-winged warbler, 2 thin white wing bars that are well separated, no hint of yellow in those wing bars. We also weigh the bird. These golden-winged warblers weigh between 9 and 12 grams, so very, very light. They fit inside old film canisters, so that's what we'll stick them in head first to weigh them on our scale. And we only attach nanotags or other scientific devices if they weigh enough. So if the device weighs more than 5% of the bird, we let the bird go. We do not attach anything to it except a bird band, which is aluminum. It has a specific number on it. So if we catch that bird again, we can say, oh, it's now 3 years old and it's been coming to this property for the past 2 years. So it helps us learn about these birds over time. If they're part of a more intensive study, we'll often put a color band on the bird so that we don't need to catch the bird and hold it in hand in order to identify it. We can use binoculars or a camera or work with volunteers to go out and photograph the bird and its bands. So we say, oh, we found Dr. White again today. How's he doing? Oh, he was feeding the young. That's just great. And so those color bands help us identify individuals from a distance. This is some photos from 2017, working with landowners in the Middlebury area, I think in Weybridge specifically. We see another blue-winged warbler. I'm sorry. It's a hybrid over here on the left. It's mostly a blue-winged warbler, but we see tinges of yellow in those wing bars. So it has some golden-winged warbler DNA. We can tell that this is a after second year bird, so it's at least 2 years old by the amount of white in its feathers, in its tail feathers. Younger birds will have less white on the tail feathers. And again, Mark with a mist net over on the right. And of course, when possible, we try to engage with the landowners, get them excited about the birds, and we'll maybe even let them release the bird, which is a great experience to hold a wild bird and watch it fly away. In this photo, can anybody spy the bird or birds that are present?
Golden winged. Looks like a golden winged.
I'd say a golden wing / blue wing, or 2 golden wing / blue wings.
Yeah, absolutely. So this bird we did classify as a golden wing, even though its wing patch is not quite fully connected. We do see there is some yellow, a yellow wash to these gray feathers, and the rest of the bird gave us characteristics of a pure golden wing. So this photo, we can't see all the bird, but we were able to study this bird long enough to categorize it as a golden wing warbler. And then there is a second bird above the golden wing warbler, and this is a female blue-winged warbler. And we were able to observe this bird, and come July, we saw it, and we knew it was the same bird because it has an orange color band on its left foot. Also the same pattern in the wings. And it was bringing caterpillars to this one part of a bush. And upon closer study, maybe another 20 minutes or so, we were able to observe a hybrid offspring. And so it likely came from that same golden wing warbler and female blue wing warbler. And it has some Brewster's warbler characteristics. A little bit of yellow in the front, so maybe not a pure Brewster's as far as one could call a pure Brewster's, but yellow cap of a golden wing or a blue wing, a lot of black in the face like a golden wing warbler, And then it's still developing its adult plumage. So we see just this mix of gray feathers that a lot of young winged warblers have. But it was really neat to watch this hybridization in live time, almost in one season, to see a golden wing and a blue wing come together and produce one of those hybrid offspring. And so the Champlain Valley of Vermont, there's hybrids everywhere. They're more abundant than pure blue wings or pure gold wings. And so if you find a spot where these birds are hanging out, you could be near a nest, check back there frequently, and you might be able to see the offspring and what characteristics they have. This is from our 2019 radio telemetry study. So we can see one of the nanotags on the back of the bird here. It has a thin antenna. Research shows that for the most part, these antennas do not impact the behavior of the bird. Our birds are rather stubborn, and I don't know, maybe we didn't have quite the right kind of attachment technique, but they would pick these nanotags off their back sometimes. So we'd be searching for hours trying to find this bird, and then the nanotag would be down in the leaf litter, and that'd be a whole nother half hour trying to find it. But these don't harm the birds, and it helps us track their movements when they stay on the birds until they fall off. So they're designed to fall off after a certain amount of time, typically when the bird's feathers grow out, so they're not stuck on the bird for the rest of its life. But this is a beautiful adult male golden wing warbler. I believe this was also taken in Charlotte at a private property. And we see it has a white band on its leg. So I don't think this was Dr. White. This is several dozen miles away, where we didn't think Dr. White would fly and get us confused with the other white-banded birds. So the other half of radio telemetry is not only do you put the nanotag on the bird, but you have to go out and track these birds with units called receivers. So they look like handheld antennas. They're attached to a device where it's listening on a certain radio frequency, and you hold that up to your ear, and the louder that device beeps, the more directly your antenna is pointed at the bird, also the closer the bird is to. And so you can fine tune some adjustments and walk through the fields and thorns. As you can see on the right, a lot of multiflora rose in that patch, prickly alder, and lots of other delightful plants to walk through. And when you do find a bird, you take a GPS point at its location, mark where it is, time of day, what type of song is it singing, what behaviors is it doing, and as much information as we can about these birds. So it's a lot of fun. It's a good sweat during a hot summer day, but that's what we do in order to track these birds. Here's one of the nests that we found in 2019 in Charlotte. Taking a look at the outside of the nest and its position, it's very close to the ground, not more than 1 or 2 inches above the ground. It's built down in the grass, but the key structure of the nest comes from goldenrod stems or other more woody stems to build the nest within. On the outside layer, we see a lot of dried leaves. Looks like some oak, mostly, maybe hop hornbeam, American beech. And then the inside of the nest, we found, and other researchers have found this, that it's stripped bark from wild grapes. That's not the only ingredient for the inside of a nest, but we were able to observe these 2 layers to the nest. Outside, mostly leaves. Inside, a lot of stripped bark from wild grape and other plants. Looking inside, and again, we're only there for a couple seconds. We want to disturb the nest as least as possible. Just get a quick look. How many birds are there? How old do we think there are? And then we get out, cover up our tracks. One of the reasons we do that is we don't want to leave any extra human scent at that location for a predator to find the nest more easily and then eat the young, and that's fewer golden wing warblers on our landscape. So we're there for just a couple seconds. This nest had 3 young, mostly gray, only starting to develop their feathers. Really, really quite cute. We get a look again at those stripped bark that the bird is bringing in for the inner nest layer. And my last photo is a fledgling golden wing warbler, or at least we think it's mostly a golden wing warbler. Its father was a pure golden wing warbler, and the female was at least 90% golden wing warbler. So this bird is mostly golden wing warbler for sure. It's too young to really tell how this wing patch is going to develop. At this point, it looks like 2 wing bars, but who knows what it'll look like by fall. But this was getting fed caterpillars by both its mom and its dad in a very small patch of young forest surrounded by deciduous forest. So my guess is the nest was either here or through the woods. A couple 100 feet away, there was a larger patch of young forest. So this bird was flying around. It was gleaning from branches, picking insects here and there, but it was still depending on its parents for those large, nutritious, meaty caterpillars that they were bringing to it. So it's wonderful what you can find when you just sit in the woods. And I encourage all of you to get out this spring and summer. Not only look for winged warblers, but other species, both common and rare. Put them in eBirds so scientists like myself can access the data and help us conserve these species. So thank you again. I'll stop my share, and if anybody has any additional questions or comments, feel free to ask. I'll hang out for another 2 or 3 minutes, and then I should probably go eat dinner. But thank you all again. It was great to spend the evening with you, and I look forward to chatting with you more about golden wings and blue wing warblers if we ever meet up in person.